This is Monica Perez here today with our second episode on Newton. We are doing the book Makers of the Modern Mind by Thomas Neal. So we read it, we talk about it, and it's usually an eye opener. You wouldn't. This guy goes through kind of the backstory and then their philosophy, and then how their philosophy has or their work has impacted the modern mind. A lot of times, I would say the majority of times, it's not really a direct impact, or it's not what these guys would have hoped for or expected, but that their philosophies were used maybe by powers that be who would benefit from them or whatever. So Newton, though, we started last time. Apparently, he's like the biggest genius ever, which I guess everybody knew. Oh, Harry is saying he got a copy of this book and he's reading along. I like this kind of thing. I like to do it kind of together or whatever, because these kind of like just page after page of facts can really get you just like lose your concentration. So I feel like if we do it together, even for me, I've been really looking forward to it, because I'm not going to get into my whole situation, but I'm okay now. Everything's okay, except for my husband this morning woke up and he's like, oh my gosh, they're saying prepare for mudslides. So I guess that's what happens when all the fire burns all the stuff off the mountains. I don't care. I'm going to do like the old guy. There's an old guy down the street on the day of the fire. He sat on his front steps and he said, I'm not leaving. And his house is still there. So, I mean, I guess he would have left if it started to burn down, but I don't think I'm leaving this time. So we're back. I'm going to try to get back in action, try to do some newsreels, and I'm starting to book a bunch of interviews. I'm probably going to have like 1 week next week where I don't actually have anything going on. I have to go back east to get my son and bring him home now that we feel like this place is safe. I've been worried about it, but the EPA was in my front yard yesterday. If you ever see the EPA in your front yard, you're like, what are you guys doing? Anyway, but they were checking on a neighbor's solar panel, EVs, all that stuff have these batteries that they worry about. So they come through the neighborhoods and they take them. And which is like interesting. And I told them about the situation. I was worried about the air quality, and they said, you're good to go, babe. They didn't say babe, but they were thinking it. Okay, so let's dig into Newton, and thank you for your patience, and thank you so much for the people who contributed to keeping me going when I'm not producing very much. That's very, very kind, but I should be back on track in about a week. So here we go. This is section 3 of the chapter on Newton. Get a little bit of my delicious apple tea that my daughter gave me, because as you can see from my mug, I'm the world's greatest mom. And my husband was actually jealous of my mug, so my son got him best dad ever. But he said he didn't like that because what? I'm better than St. Joseph? Like, this isn't even real. So we have the competing mugs. Okay, let's hit it. Newton is most difficult to know. He seems consciously to have kept jealous guard over his mind, and biographers, therefore, find it almost impossible to discover what went on there. In the days when he did his great work at Cambridge, contemporaries did not think him worth describing, and the word pictures made after his death are tinted strongly by age and free fancy. There is no doubt, however, that Newton was no ordinary mixture of mind and matter. He was as close to pure mind as man can come. His body seems never to have been a drag on his spirit. Never did it seem to make imperious demands. Never did it cry for satisfaction. This helps account for his amazing accomplishments, for Newton could ignore bodily needs when he absorbed himself in trance-like contemplation. He had the body, as well as the mind, of an intellectual genius. Throughout life, whether he was deep in mathematical contemplation or immersed in London society, Newton was largely exempt from those passions and emotions that play so dominant a part in most men's lives. I noticed that, like, he does not need a woman. Who doesn't need a woman? I mean, I know there are people who don't need a woman, but generally speaking, among these men who are the makers of the modern mind, love, patriotism, religious exaltation are experiences he never had. His most human emotion seems to have been a filial love for his mother, but this was never the sort of attachment to upset him or interfere with his intellectual activity. He never came really to know or to understand those other men who inhabited this world, whose workings he so clearly perceived. All through life, Newton shows complete lack of tact in dealing with friend and acquaintance. Newton then was a powerful mind inhabiting an unobtrusive body. His health, in fact, was phenomenally good. He had only 2 sick spells in his life, and when he died at the age of 84, he had a full head of silvery hair and all his teeth but one. This health he enjoyed without perpetual self-doctoring, as was the case of Locke. When he was absorbed in chemical experiments or in the writing of his Principia, he slept only 4 or 5 hours a night, and he took out only a few minutes a day to bolt down some food, often eating in a standing position to save time. He could ignore his body for long stretches of time, and he could put himself into an almost mystic state of contemplation when he struggled with a mathematical problem. Just how he did this, no biographer can tell us. We simply know that it was done, and we have to accept it as fact. One of the few descriptions of Newton at work is the one given by his assistant from 1685 till 1690. So his assistant worked for him from 1685 to 1690. He was a certain Humphrey Newton, though no relative. He says, I cannot say I ever saw him laugh but once. I never knew him to take any recreation or pastime, either in riding out to take the air, walking, bowling, or any other exercise whatever, thinking all hours lost that were not spent in his studies. He ate very sparingly, nay, oft times he has forgot to eat at all. He very rarely went to bed till 2 or 3 in the morning, sometimes not until 5 or 6, lying about 4 or 5 hours. I believe he grudged the short time he spent in eating and sleeping. This description, of course, is of the Newton who was immersed in writing the Principia. The Newton who, Sullivan puts it, behaves like a man dominated by an irresistible force. He did not always work so furiously, but in the days of his great achievements, he was capable of so working, which accounts for his being so remarkable a genius in a subject to which he devoted so small a part of his time. That's interesting because they do that. Like there's theories of education, even schooling for young kids, where you do some colleges may even do this, where you do like 3 weeks of geometry and then 3 weeks of American history or whatever. I kind of like that better. I could read a book for 8 hours straight, but to read 8 books for 1 hour each, which maybe is what we're doing right now. I'm just saying, I get it. The fact that Newton thought mathematics and science of secondary importance does not detract from his unusual ability in these subjects. On the contrary, it makes him all the more unusual, for he is unique in excelling in something he thought relatively unimportant. Yet, despite his competence in science, his attitude toward the subject was hardly scientific, as we understand the term today. He viewed it much more as a lawyer or a professional baseball player might look at it. He had absolutely no interest in promoting it. He never wanted to pass his discoveries on to others or even to publish them for the profit of fellow scientists. He would never have worked on an atomic bomb project or even on the application of atomic energy to practical peaceful purposes. He would never have done cooperative work, for he was interested only in solving problems, in finding answers that had never been found before. When he found the answer, he was content. Newton, furthermore, never thought of science serving utilitarian purposes. He never considered science man's handmaiden who, when properly trained, could be put to cleaning kitchens or seasoning meat, both of which I did today. If mathematics and science were to serve an ulterior purpose with Newton, they were to lead to a firmer belief in God's existence and to a surer knowledge of his nature. for he always looked upon science as subordinate to theology and as legitimately connected with it. So this seems to be a major pattern here. It seems that these guys think they're serving God, and really they're paving the way to a godless future. And I think of it this way, that I'm not sure if I've mentioned this in the series before, but when I first became an anarcho-capitalist, I thought, wow, it was really the anarchy part that was like mind-boggling. I thought people back people had the same reaction to the question, is government necessary, as I imagine they did in the Middle Ages to the question, does God exist? Like, how is that even a question? It's the question itself that's shocking. So I feel like these guys, I'm trying to define, and if anybody wants to pitch in, let me know. I'm trying to, in order to understand this book better, I'm trying to understand what is the modern mind? What is the pre-modern mind? And what is the post-modern mind? Because this was written the first time in the 40s and the second time in the 50s. And while, of course, it's 500 years of value, or 400, things have changed a little bit since then. There is the postmodern Foucault and these guys. But what do they mean by the pre-modern mind? And I think he kind of describes it here and there in this book, saying that I think it was basically a Catholic world. This book starts with Luther. So right before that would be a Catholic world where I'm pretty sure you do what I was taught by my parents, who were kind of pre-Vatican II. So I think Vatican II kind of put the last nail in the coffin, where you're just thinking about doing stuff for the next life. And there's an objective morality. It's kind of top down. They do all the thinking for you. You have to consult your conscience, and you have to come up with your own motivation and all that. But it's kind of clear cut what we're supposed to do, which is great. Like, I like it. And I like the classics of, if there's a defined body of knowledge that's essential for human civilization, society, education, and we all share it, we all have common reference points, we can learn the same lessons. The way we all know about The Simpsons. If we all understood Socrates, we wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel or Aristotle, or St. Thomas Aquinas. I mean, or all ideas are Greek in origin. So I think there was a time, I consider it a regression, honestly, but it could be because I'm Catholic. But even without that, I think the classical education thing, it's a regression. That's why the homeschoolers go Are you still here, people? Am I still here? Lost my people. Okay, guys. I don't know if anybody's here, but I'm going to. Well, I guess I am here. I'm going to finish. If I can, if I get kicked off again, I will stop and just do it separately. I'll do a part two. Let me write that down. Okay. Sorry about that. That's it, babes. I think that's it. This is my last chance, my last attempt. Okay. Okay, guys. Here we go. One more time. So it says, for he always looked upon, this is about Newton, getting back on track, for he always looked upon science as subordinate to theology and as legitimately connected with it. Quote, to discourse of God from the appearance of things, he insists, does certainly belong to natural philosophy. On various occasions, he commented that the chief value of his scientific work lay in the support it gave to revealed religion. The Principia and the Optics he considered useful chiefly for making manifest God's laws and partly revealing his nature. So this is what I was thinking, is that when the thing I hated the most about chemtrails, whatever they are, whether they're sprayed or they're coming out the butt of a jet, they do change the color of the sunsets. So like almost every sunset I see now is pink. And I used to think looking at a sunset was like seeing the face of God reflected, or this is what pleases God. And made in his image, it pleases us too. But it just makes me so mad because you think you're looking at nature and really you're just looking at pollution. And isn't it funny how that changes how you think? Because you're looking at a sunset to see the face of God. So you're looking at it to see the face of God. So it's more interesting that way. And you might get something out of it. But if you're seeing the face of, the signature of boron, is boron even a thing? I don't know. Anyway, such an attitude towards science was normal for Newton's age. But because Newton soon became science incarnate, this point must be emphasized for a proper understanding of Newton the man. Infidels, Newton wrote 3 letters to him on the connection of science and religion. In the first of them, he observed, "When I wrote my treatise about our system, I had an eye upon such principles as might work with considering men, for the belief of a deity, and nothing can rejoice me more than to find it useful for that purpose." Let's see. Line that the Principia undermined religion. So when Newton prepared a second edition of this famous work, he added a general scholium in which he advanced his beliefs in God's existence and tried to show with a flourish how this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. When he finally published his lectures on optics in 1704, he devoted several pages to showing how the machine-like design of the universe argues back to the existence of an intelligent designer. Then he went on to show how a fuller knowledge of science will enlighten mankind ethically and theologically. If natural philosophy in all its parts shall at length be perfected, the bounds of moral philosophy will be also enlarged. For so far as we can know by natural philosophy what is the so far our duty towards him, as well as that towards one another, will appear to us by the light of nature. That is so consistent with what I was saying. I'm going to read it again in case it cut out because I see it is sketchy. For so far as we can know by natural philosophy, which benefits we receive from him, so far our duty towards him, as well as that towards one another, will appear to us by the light of nature. Interesting. Science then was to serve the ulterior purpose of revealing God to us, but in itself, Newton thought it was a dry subject. Even in his most fertile periods, he looked upon science as an irksome taskmaster, and frequently during his lifetime, he threatened to abandon it for keeps. As early as 1674, he wrote to Oldenburg, Secretary of the Royal Society, "I have long since determined to concern myself no further about the promotion of philosophy, natural science, and for the same reason I must desire to be excused from engaging to exhibit yearly philosophic discourses." He had been annoyed, as he was to be all his life, at the obtuseness of scientists who could not understand what he said. Yeah, but he made it hard to understand on purpose. They threw up absurd objections and demanded that he disprove various hypotheses. "I see," he therefore concluded, "a man must either resolve to put out nothing new or become a slave to defend it." He could therefore write to Halley, when the young astronomer was urging him to publish, that philosophy is such an impertinently litigious lady that a man had as good be engaged to lawsuits as to have to do with her. When Hooke endeavored to engage him in scientific correspondence again, Newton answered rather petulantly, "I had for some years last been endeavoring to bend myself from philosophy to other studies, insomuch that I have long grutched the time spent in that study, unless it be perhaps at idle hours, sometimes for diversion." Grutched. But fortunately for science, Newton was skillfully handled by his young associates. Haley talked him into writing the Principia, and young Roger Coates urged him to prepare a second edition. The optics would never have appeared, Newton tells his readers, had not the importunity of friends prevailed upon me. His minor papers were prepared in connection with his work at Cambridge or as contributions to the proceedings of the Royal Society. So even though Newton considered science a barren subject, an impertinently litigious lady, he nevertheless contributed more to its development than any single predecessor in history. We have seen that Newton, this is section 4. We have seen that Newton devoted the greater part of his time to non-scientific studies, that in mere quantity of note-taking and authorship, his work in these subjects far surpassed his labors in the scientific field. What he produced in these subjects is worthless today. Excuse me. And even in his own day, it was of little value. Newton was a genius in only one field, but a genius cannot be adequately known if he is observed only in the fields of his precocity. We must therefore see what he tried to do in his chemical experiments and in his researches into the Bible, Harry was talking about. Yes, there's no footnotes or bibliography in this, but I looked a little bit into the biography of Thomas Neal, and I guess he was a lecturer and had other maybe professor, and his books like this, he said, were just basically lectures transcribed because he felt that that was made it easier reading. But still, he should have footnotes in a bibliography. Newton surprises his biographer with his vast erudition in non-scientific studies, and he disappoints him with his almost paralytic inability to put that erudition to use. His learning in history was immense for his age and his knowledge of geography, for his age, his time, and his knowledge of geography perhaps as great as that of any Englishman of his day. He edited Varenius's Geography, the outstanding treatise at the time, and he lectured on geography from the Lucasian chair at Cambridge. Experiments in chemistry perhaps occupied more hours of his life than study in any other field. Even in the heat, let me ask you this about geography. Do you know any truck drivers? My dad and brothers are truck drivers. They know so much about geography. Even not just like the highways and byways of the US, but like the world. It just gets in their heads, I guess. Experiments in chemistry perhaps occupied more hours of his life than study in any other field because he was interested in alchemy, if I recall correctly. Even in the heat of composing his Principia, Newton did not neglect his chemical experiments. His interest was devoted chiefly to that rather bizarre pseudochemistry which so gripped the best thinkers of his day. Alchemy, the philosopher's stone, and the elixir of life were the elusive subjects which he pursued year after year. He seems indeed to be less of a scientific in the field of chemistry than a mystic. Harry loves geography. I wonder if Harry is a truck driver. But here he was only following the other great minds of his day, men like Boyle, Locke, and Hooke. There is nothing surprising in Newton being an alchemist, Sullivan says. What is surprising, considering the time and thought he devoted to the matter, is that he should have done so little in the way of genuine scientific discovery. In this region, he seems to show none of that power of isolating the essentials of a problem, which is so characteristic of his other scientific work. Robert Boyle believed that he had discovered the secret of making gold by treating a certain kind of red dirt with mercury. He still had not made gold when he died, but he left his recipe and some red dirt to Locke and Newton. The latter believed that such a transmutation as Boyle envisaged was possible, but he grew skeptical about the latter's process when he found that others had worked so long and so fruitlessly at the task. He seems to have remained skeptical of the actual transmutation being accomplished in his day, but he never doubted that gold could be made from baser material. So they didn't understand the concept of elements? I mean, maybe they can make diamonds out of my dog. I did not do that, but look it up. Make a diamond out of your dog. Ugh. Newton's work in religion shows him absorbed in two main problems. So, but diamond is not an element. Anyway, first, I mean, I guess it's carbon. Anyway, first of all, good Whig that he was, which, by the way, are just for people who are believers in the biologic origin of oil. I know people totally believe it, and I don't know for sure not, but coal, diamonds, and oil are all just different phases of carbon, if I'm not mistaken, under different amounts of pressure. Diamonds are so far down there, they could not possibly have biologic origins. I think they're changing their story now, but when I was growing up, they said anything carbon is biologic in nature. I mean, that can't really even be true, but that was kind of the rule of thumb. Anyway, Newton's work in religion shows him absorbed in two main problems. First of all, good Whig that he was, he sought to expose the false pretensions of the Roman Catholic Church and establish the Bible as the sole rule of faith. Second, he took the view, exceedingly radical in his day, making him liable to severe punishment, that the traditional Christian teaching on the Trinity was false. His arguments against the claims of the Catholic Church interest us chiefly for showing how much he knew, rightly or wrongly, about church history, the early councils, the ancient heresies, the Roman and Greek fathers of the church. The Apocalypse and the books of Daniel particularly interested him, partly because he believed they furnished him with ammunition against the papists, and partly because of their mystical prophecies. And Newton was ever drawn irresistibly toward the mystical. He interpreted the prophecy. I'm actually going to keep recording in this stream. I know everybody's gone, but that way we don't have to stitch together two videos. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to change my little message. All right, peeps. New message. There you go. I'm going to keep going. Thanks for sticking with me. Even though I had a message that said if I blink out, leave, but I'm going to keep going because I want this to be. There's a series in there. You can get them all. So I'm just going to keep going. Thanks for being here. Should I read faster? That's not my style. Okay. Yeah, it's do that last. Okay. Newton concluded from his study of the prophets that the Catholic Church would fall about AD 2000. I think the church has basically fallen. His arguments against the Trinity were more cautiously advanced and were published posthumously. For Newton, I'd take that back. The church is the people. But the hierarchy, not so bueno. His arguments against the Trinity were more cautiously advanced and were published posthumously. For Newton was not one to risk his position at the mint and his honors for anything. His line of argument was that belief in the Trinity rested mainly on two scriptural passages, and these were corruptions introduced by St. Jerome in his Latin translation of the original text. Interesting. Newton's faith in the Bible itself remained unshaken. The authority of emperors, kings, and princes, he wrote, is human. The authority of the prophets is divine. And if an angel from heaven preach any other gospel than what they have delivered, let him be accursed. Newton evidently believed that scriptural scholarship could determine for once and for all what the prophets had said and what they meant by what they said. His own scriptural scholarship is curious for the way he sought to verify the prophets' statements by intricate chronological tables and to support their theology by mathematical analysis. But when Bentley accused him of expounding prophecies as he demonstrated mathematical propositions, Newton was evidently annoyed at what he thought unfair criticism. His idea of God is given tersely in the General Scholium at the end of the second edition of the Principia. Newton's is a personal God, but imperceptibly he becomes the God of deism, the all-knowing, all-good creator who, after making the best possible universe and giving it ironclad rules of operation, withdrew into his heavens to watch his perfect piece of machinery tick away with beautiful precision. Wasn't like Thomas Jefferson and that gang, deists? This God was Jesus then. His wisdom, his power, and his dominion we can know from his handiwork. But we can learn nothing of his nature. We have ideas of his attributes, Newton concludes, but we have absolutely no idea of the substance of God. Newton's religious views were one thing, his scientific another. He apparently did not think them incompatible, however, for when his system of the world, as laid down in the Principia, was attacked by continental philosophers as subversive of religion, Newton was genuinely hurt. But Leibniz and his associates were right in insisting that nature became divine in Newton's world machine, that both God and man took minor roles. Newton's religious beliefs, nevertheless, were not in conformity with his rigorous laws of mechanics. He was a confessing member of the Church of England, whose only heretical view was his skeptical attitude towards the Trinity. Do you think that's true? Newton's religious beliefs were not in conformity with his rigorous laws of mechanics? Well, if they had quantum physics, they would know that, at least as a scientific principle, free will is consistent with the laws of the universe, assuming that that's correct. I don't know. All right, we're in section 5. Newton's big contribution toward the making of the modern mind lies in his scientific thought and in his methodology. The Newtonian method came to be the method, not only for scientific investigation, but for everything. His friend Locke, for example, hoped to construct a system of ethics which would follow the line of reasoning and the system of demonstration used in the Principia. The Newtonian method became, by the time of his death, the method of investigation in economics and politics, in physics and chemistry, in all social and physical sciences. I frame no hypotheses, Newton said time and again. And in this statement, he summed up his radical departure from the method of his predecessors and his contemporaries. In his day, the Cartesian method, which based science on metaphysics, was still the vogue. Factual data were still compressed into an hypothesis obtained from philosophy. Cartesians believed that if one start with the correct theories, experiment was unnecessary. To come to the right conclusion, one had only to reason rightly. Yeah, that feels kind of backwards. I think Newton's right. Observe, conclude, and extrapolate or interpolate, perhaps. To Newton, on the contrary, the physical universe was an unknown. There were no axioms or theories that had to be substantiated. If you actually start with a hypothesis, you're almost destined to have, what do you call that? Bias, fallacy of bias. I don't know. Whatever. You know what I'm saying? As far as Newton was concerned, anything could happen. Rivers could run uphill or fire could freeze. He was interested in discovering what did occur, and he was free to admit whatever he discovered by observation or by experiment. His refusal to lay down a priori conditions which the phenomena were to fulfill was so novel that Newton simply was not comprehended by his contemporaries. Even so competent a scientist as Huygens did not understand the Englishman's point of view. Newton repeatedly insisted that he was not writing about hypotheses, that he was only describing experiments and from them drawing conclusions, but all in vain. I think we've gotten away from this in modern time. First, you decide mRNA is safe, then, oh my gosh, that will literally get me flagged. That is why he was bewildered and annoyed by objections that he had not confirmed or rejected this or that hypothesis. His inductive study of phenomena, however, was only the first step for Newton. And as far as his 18th century followers are concerned, it was the least important step. By analysis of his observed facts, he arrived at a fundamental principle. Then he proceeded to deduce the mathematical consequences of this principle, and finally to check his conclusions with further observation. In his first published paper, Newton explains his diligently into the properties of things and of establishing those properties by experiments, and then to proceed more slowly to hypotheses for the explanation of them. For hypotheses should be subservient only in explaining the properties of things, but not assumed in determining them. He explained this method more fully in the Principia. Whatever is not deduced from the phenomena is to be called an hypothesis. And hypotheses, whether metaphysical or physical, whether of occult qualities or mechanical, have no place in experimental philosophy. In this philosophy, particular propositions are inferred from the phenomena and afterwards rendered general by induction. Thus it was that the impenetrability, the mobility, and the impulsive force of bodies and the laws of motion and of gravitation were discovered. And to us, it is enough that gravity does really exist and act according to the laws which we have explained. So, oh my gosh, there's Grizz. I'm going to go with Grizz. Science, Newton held, was concerned only with descriptive work. His task was merely to discover how things worked, not why. He therefore insisted that it was not the province of science to discover ultimate causes or to investigate the essence of things. To tell us that every species of things is endowed with an occult, specific quality by which it acts and produces manifest effects is to tell us nothing. But to derive 2 or 3 general principles of motion from phenomena, and afterwards to tell us how the properties and actions of all corporeal things follow from those manifest principles, would be a very great step in philosophy, though the causes of those principles were not yet discovered. Here again, he was misunderstood by his contemporaries, for they were not content with a descriptive law of gravity. They demanded a theory which would show not only how gravity worked, but why it worked as it did. They demanded to know whether Descartes' hypothesis of vortices, for example, was right or wrong. Before long, however, the Newtonian method of investigation and the Newtonian concept of science as a descriptive subject came to be universally accepted. Yeah, so if they want to know if Descartes' hypothesis of vortices is wrong, they could just conduct experiments, figure it out. He taught them how to fish. Newton's discoveries in mathematics and physics are so well known that every college student is acquainted with them. They are so much a part of our common knowledge that little more is required here than to catalog them and credit them to their author. His first important discovery was calculus, but because he guarded it so successfully and because he did not develop a system of notation for it, his contribution to mathematical knowledge in this respect is negligible. Yes, he would be known as the inventor of calculus. Leibniz's system of notation is the one that came to be adopted, and calculus would be the same subject it is today had Newton never lived. But his famous law of gravitation is quite another thing. See, that's why if you go back and think, if this person hadn't existed or if that person hadn't existed, I think things would still unfold the way, I mean, I don't know about like the black nobility and stuff, or the Borgias, like such essential, like who would it be in history who really wouldn't have been, the same path would not have been taken. I don't know. I don't know if there's any single person or family in history that could have brought us to a point today where we were living in liberty or progressing towards liberty, or maybe we're just in a point on the timeline where we're moving away from that. Maybe we'll move back to it. But his famous law of gravitation is quite another thing. Others had floundered toward a law of gravitation, but they had never been able to apply mathematics to their experimentally obtained knowledge and thus to arrive at a general law. Newton himself was held up for about 20 years by a mathematical difficulty. I thought this was the guy who figured stuff like this out over dinner. But when he saw that bodies were attracted to each other as though each had its mass concentrated in a single point at its center, he was able to state his famous law that, quote, any two particles of matter in the universe attract one another with a force which is directly proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Yep, directly proportional to the product of their masses. So if you multiply their masses, and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Cool. So mass and distance. E equals mc squared. Is that a kind of form of that? In this way, he was able to explain the motion of the Earth and the stars and the moon. In this way, even comets were shown to follow regular paths and to behave according to physical laws. Newton's work on light reveals him at his experimental best, for he even ground his own lenses and prepared his own special equipment for these experiments. By patiently studying the reflection, refraction, and diffraction of light under varying conditions, he discovered that various colors have different constant refrangibilities. From this discovery, he was able to show that white light is made up of the light of all the colors. All this he did before he was 25. His later work on light did not yield such remarkable discoveries, for Newton never settled on one theory of light, and it is typical of scientific bent of mind that his last words on light are in the form of queries. But we still don't know. This idea of waves and particles, I think, So I got to keep going because this needs to be in the can at some point. So thank you very much. Okie dokie. So Newton's Principia, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, Newton's Principia is his great accomplishment, both by reason of its contents and because of the amazingly short time in which he drew up, proved, and wrote out the propositions and problems making up this work. There are 3 books in the Principia containing 150 propositions. Almost every one of these involves the presentation of corollaries and scholia, as well as the principal problem, all of which involves a tremendous amount of calculation, illustration, and explanation. It is for this reason that commentators on the Principia use such adjectives as incomparable and incomprehensible when they tell how Newton accomplished the task in 17 months. The book is written in what Sullivan calls a style of glacial remoteness, which makes no concessions to the reader. A style that Newton purposely adopted, he said, to avoid being baited by little smatterers in mathematics. The particular propositions he proved in the Principia need not concern us here. It is sufficient to note that in it, Newton applies mathematics to an explanation of the motion of the universe, that his dynamics informs the entire work, that in it he shows how the sun's mass can be calculated, how the moon is attracted by the sun as well as by the earth, how lawless comets are brought under the universal law of gravitation as members of the sun's system. Interesting. And most important, the Principia contain Newton's law of gravitation, the law which so beautifully unified and systematized the mass of natural phenomena that had till then apparently been without sense or system. It is no wonder that Newton came to be hailed the discoverer of nature's laws, the man who showed that all matter acted according to a uniform, intelligible law. Because he enabled men to reduce the movements of the universe to laws they could write out and understand, Newton made the world a thoroughly intelligible place for the first time in history. And men worshiped him for his accomplishment. That's interesting. They worshiped him because maybe this is why they kind of say that Newton replaced God, because you could predict. But, couldn't the ancients predict also? I don't know. The comet thing must have been a good little party trick. Anyway, for almost 200 years, his system remained intact. Nothing in it was disproved and very little was improved. Not until Darwin's work suggested evolution and development in the universe was any serious addition made to the Newtonian concept of a stable world machine, which had always run according to the same laws, with the same speed and force through the same space. Not until Einstein's work in relativity early in this century was there any reason for believing that perhaps Newton's laws were not as universally valid as men had unquestioningly believed for so long. Newton had subjected the phenomena of nature to the laws of mathematics. He had discovered nature to be a wonderful machine whose movements could be explained mechanically. For him, space and time were 2 absolutes existing independently of each other. Time, as a matter of fact, plays no part in the Newtonian machine. For practical purposes, it is ignored. Newton looked upon matter as a third independent entity, something thrust into time and space. The interdependence of these 3 elements never occurred to Newton. So now we're talking Einstein. He was content that matter existed in time and space and that it obeyed certain mechanical laws which man was able to discover. And this, for his day, was a great accomplishment. So great was it indeed, and so completely did it offer a rational explanation of the universe, that until a century ago, no one dared question the Cambridge professor's conclusions in the field of science. Oh, we're on section 6. Newton was science, and science was intellectual king of the modern world. To disagree with Newton was intellectual treason for which only a madman could be excused. All that has changed now. Newton explained the universe, but today his explanation is considered both inadequate and partly incorrect. His fundamental assumptions of space, time, and matter have changed so that Newton would never recognize them now. His work on mass, force, gravitation, and light has been superseded by developments from the discovery of electricity and of the atomic composition of matter. Scientists today look upon Newton as a 17th century genius who completed, quote, the scientific revolution of his age and passed on its accomplishments, packaged nicely to the 18th century. Although he remains a big name in the history of science, he is no longer science incarnate. If only scientists and mathematicians had been affected by Newton, he would not be a maker of the modern mind. His influence, however, was felt in every field of thought. The Newtonian mind infused the bodies of all thinking men in the 18th century. One who had not adopted this Newtonian mind was simply an intellectual fuddy-duddy. Such popularization was accomplished because men who had never read a word Newton wrote still thought they knew him. Voltaire, himself no expert in science, complained that very few people read Newton because it is necessary to be learned to understand him. But everybody talks about him. So Voltaire told Frenchmen all about Newton in his Elements de la philosophie de Newton, published 21 years before anyone bothered to translate the Principia into French. Newton was popularized more suddenly and more widely than any thinker before him in history. Before the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789, there were at least 40 books about the Principia alone in English, 17 in French, 11 in Latin, and a few in German, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese. But this was only part of the campaign to sell Newton's system to the world, to its inhabitants. Typical of the medium through which Newton passed on to ordinary people is the work published in 1751 by the popular lecturer Benjamin Martin. Quote, a plain and familiar introduction to the Newtonian a plain and familiar introduction to the Newtonian philosophy in 6 lectures, illustrated by 6 copper plates, designed for the use of such gentlemen and ladies as would acquire a competent knowledge of this science without mathematical learning, and more especially those who have or may attend the author's course of 6 lectures and experiments on these subjects. End quote. Newton had written with icy remoteness to avoid being bothered by amateur scientists, but his popularizers went to extremes in melting him down for easy consumption by lazy minds. In 1756, James Ferguson, for example, published his Astronomy Explained Upon Newton's Principles and made easy to those who have studied mathematics, a work which went through 7 editions in 17 years. In 1737, Count Allegretti published Il Newtonianismo per la Dame, which went through several editions in Italian and several more in its French translations. Newtonianism was not confined to popularized science. Even during Newton's lifetime, as we have seen, Bentley used the Principia to prove God's existence. And Colin Maclaurin, a young professor of mathematics at Edinburgh in Newton's old age, wrote an account of Sir Isaac Newton's philosophical discoveries, in which he dogmatically expounded a general philosophy of the universe, including God, nature, and man, all based on his oracle, Newton. To inquire into the whole constitution of the universe, he claimed, is the business of natural philosophy, which is chiefly to be valued as it lays a sure foundation for natural religion and moral philosophy, by leading us in a satisfactory manner to the knowledge of the author and governor of the universe. So I guess that's, what Newton was saying, that science is to be valued as a way to better know God. I think that's reasonable. And didn't Einstein say, the only thing I wish is to know the mind of God? I think he, believe it or not, although I thought he was an atheist. Anyway, maybe he meant it in a not literal way. These broader uses of Newton's thought gave him a popularity and an importance far beyond that of a scientific genius kept in his laboratory. The late Carl Becker put it well when he concluded, his name became a symbol which called up in the mind of the reading and thinking public a generalized conception of the universe, a kind of philosophical premise of the most general type, one of those uncriticized preconceptions which so largely determined the social and political as well as the strictly scientific thinking of the age. In this respect, Newton's importance in the eyes of the public lay largely in his seeming to have banished mystery from the world. Philosophy, the designation he always gave to his scientific work, took on the clarity of mathematics and the easy method of patient observation. Where Descartes had failed in his ambition to make philosophy and with it the world a thoroughly intelligible place, Newton seemed to have succeeded. Everything moved according to law, and man could, by patient observation, careful experiment, and mathematical speculation, lay bare these laws. All the universe seemed so reasonable, so understandable. Indirectly but powerfully nonetheless, Newton contributed to the optimism which flooded like warm sunshine across the 18th century mind. Pope, the rhyming mirror of that mind, showed Newton's powerful influence when, in an age of wars and plague and famine, he had we have one page left. So let's do it. The laws of nature replace blah, blah, blah. The old natural law was normative. Okay, thus the laws of nature replaced the natural law of philosophers of days gone by. The old natural law was normative. It told men through their conscience what they should and should not do. But after Newton, natural law is identified popularly with physical law. It becomes deterministic rather than normative. And when it is transferred into such fields as economics and politics, it becomes the physical law of supply and demand, or the deterministic law of oligarchy. That is natural law in the social sciences. Newton is at least remotely connected with Representative Roe's profession of faith made in Congress in 1946. I believe the law of supply and demand is a natural, divine, God-given law that cannot be set aside by man any more than we can stop the sun from shining or the tide from ebbing and flowing. A perfect example in one sentence of the new concept of natural law, which Newton unwittingly created and others witlessly transferred into other fields than the scientific. The Newtonian method, as well as Newtonian conclusions, held the field for 2 centuries in scientific thought. Newton combined with his friend Locke to replace the Cartesian deductive system of reasoning from fundamental axioms with the new empirical method. Okay, so that's important. Newton combined with Locke to replace Cartesian deductive system of reasoning from fundamental axioms with the new empirical method. For this, Newton can be given no large share of credit. But the new way of discovering truth was identified with him as well as with Locke, and where it battled Cartesianism, it had the support of his august authority. Because Hume's skepticism made Newton's position philosophically untenable within 50 years, Kant will find it necessary to defend the Newtonian universe and method against Hume's thoroughgoing skepticism. So Newton's system was soon under attack philosophically, but scientifically it was not questioned for 200 years. The author of the Principia affected religion in curious and ironic fashion. His religious heterodoxy, which his associates so much feared, had no influence at all. But his scientific work, which both he deified nature, Newton had, whether he realized it or not, deified nature and depersonalized God. Nature was made absolute. God and man shrank beside her. God was allowed to be the great mechanic, the master architect, the final force, or some such thing called upon to account for the world machine's existence. After his act of creation, however, he was pushed off to his heaven and told to stay there. And before long, Newton's scientific system was used as ammunition against the God of the Bible, whom he thought he was revealing through his works. Leon Bloch, for example, tells the readers of his La Philosophie de Newton, henceforth it will be possible for natural science, that is to say physics, not only to struggle against theology, but to supplant it. The contradictory gods of the revealed religions will be replaced by a new idea, that of a being who is known to us through his works and to whom we can attain only through science. The universal order, symbolized henceforth by the law of gravitation, takes on a clear and positive meaning. There is a last sour little note to be added about Newton's influence on the modern mind, and this was hardly his fault. Englishmen, following their great scientist blindly, with stupid loyalty to him and with a strong nationalist antipathy toward non-British scientists, cut themselves off from communication with the rest of European thought. They stuck not only to Newton's ideas, but also to his difficult methods of solving problems and to his clumsy notation. They went into intellectual isolation and they fell a century behind the continent in mathematics and the allied sciences. All this came from the silly quarrel between Newton and Leibniz, and as a result, in Bell's words, quote, the obstinate British practically rotted mathematically for all of a century after Newton's death. Well, thank you for sticking with me. That was crazy. I'm sorry. If I don't get this thing fixed, I'll just do it offline and upload it. And maybe even get in the chat and hang out, but I won't do this to you again. Thank you for sticking with me. Next is Rousseau. So you can't see it, but it's chapter 7, person 7 is Rousseau. The heart knows best. Thank you all very much for coming. See you soon.